other people today?
I don't think so. Tim said he wasn't going to make it.
Yeah,
True.
the key people are here.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Joshua and Jean have been laying low a bit the past meetings. So.
Yes.
Yeah. So two things happened since the last call, basically. Like the first thing is I went with Marc-Antoine over his model to completely understand it. And then we tried to reduce it so it only contains the glossary terms, basically. And then we condensed it down to something more specific instead of the generic model Marc-Antoine is proposing. And I also talked to Stephen, and we also went over this diagram and identified some focus points that are probably good to talk about, where everybody agrees on that we should talk about them. So maybe that's a good
Well,
way
let's
to
go.
make progress.
Let's go over the points. I saw that Stephen introduced a new modeling technique.
True. Yeah.
I went over. We had a long argument on the Hangouts channel. Sorry, everybody, and we never got to have a real discussion about it. I mean, an in-person discussion. It was a real discussion, I guess.
Yeah, I was all over the place. I was walking around, and I couldn't get you on a video call indeed. I'm sorry for that.
Yeah. And I didn't connect yesterday because yesterday was absolutely crazy, or Sunday. So that means I just started reading on the new domain language you propose. I will look it over. And I will discuss the proposal of using that technique and its gains and limitations. I don't think it's a panacea either, but it has certainly gains to be worth following. But maybe you should go over the points of contention or the points of discussion that you saw, Felix.
I know it's like I think the first thing that helps us frame everything is that Stephen quickly presents his diagram, because he actually wrote the context down for the different groups.
Who is our mysterious attendee? DD9QJVE.
That's his name. Yeah.
Yes, that's my name.
Hey, Tim.
Hi, Tim.
Hi. Yeah, I'm in the street. So I'll be a lot more listening than participating.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, Felix, if everyone else is okay with that, I just like to, before going to points of contention, I would just like to introduce what the point is of these bounded context diagrams, what a bounded context is, and why I think it's useful if we collaboratively create one, like as in not just me add one. The one that I added on the Hangout channel right now is just an example to highlight one point of contention that we've been talking about for the past week. But it's more about the process than anything at this point. Is that okay?
I think it still makes sense to, like, you present the one you created.
Yeah, I'll do that in order to explain it, but this is considered an example, not what it should be. Can you see my screen?
Yeah. Society library is missing.
Yeah, exactly. And as is Ysaurus, as is
yeah, but good point. Yeah, okay.
So I didn't include everything. I just included the points of contention from the past week. But so first things first, I added some summary descriptions of bounded context in Hangouts, but to give a quick summary for those that didn't read the entire monologue that I posted there. A bounded context is basically, it's a boundary of use cases, business use cases that all belong together and that you want to constrain together, that they all depend on one another. So it's sometimes also called a constraint boundary or a transactional boundary on a more operational level when you actually implement it. So it's stuff that belongs together, and decoupling it would imply that there's a lot of messages that have to go back and forth between two different separate bounded contexts. Now, what that means from a technical perspective is less relevant right now than what it means from an organizational perspective, like how we talk about things, how we structure things, how we focus on things. So that's the main benefit of bounded context at this point. That said, the point is, though, that by doing that, you also get these isolated contexts within which you actually do software development. But that's only as a result because you actually identify it as isolated use cases that need to be supported separately. So it all boils down to use cases you try to support within a bounded context, political organizations that are interested in supporting these use cases, like who works together on what, and having a shared language that you use while talking about one specific bounded context. Now, when I tried to introduce the glossary a couple of months ago, my goal for that was for it to be a ubiquitous language to talk about argument modeling. But through various discussions, we discovered that argument modeling is very broad. We all have different perceptions on what that means, and there are different use cases that different people might want to support. So the suggested process with creating a diagram like this would be to collaboratively identify use cases we want to support, try to align ourselves with the use cases we all share, that we all want to support, see where we differ so that we can maybe identify different bounded context we have. And this diagram here is one example of that I did, because I think a lot of people of CDL, they want to do argument modeling. Can you see my mouse?
Yes.
So this is, I think, what most of us have been trying to talk about, which is just a feature, you could say, in when implementing an argumentation technology, be it for Society Library, be it for my own project Socrates, be it for Timothy's canonical database, be it for hyperknowledge or reason score. We just want to represent an argument and have the same understanding of what an argument is and how we model it. I think a first goal would be that each of the individual projects reuses a library, actual code that we can build on top of that model. That's what a shared kernel relationship means in domain-driven design. So my website has its own goals, its own purposes, but I do want to share this argument modeling component. I think Timothy wants to do the same, and other people want to do the same. So you can see these are actually two different visions, two different use cases. I'm more focused on user interaction design. Timothy is more focused on cataloging all canonical claims. Marc-Antoine might be more focused on creating a universal knowledge database, etc. These are slightly differing, maybe overlapping visions and use cases, but we need to deconstruct that to see where we are actually aligned and where we are not aligned. So this is one. And then I think the main point of contention, looking back at the past 2 weeks or so, has been that we have wildly differing opinions on how curation should be done. Like I always, before I even start talking to CDL people, I always considered a stack exchange model where you gain reputation points and then you can just make certain changes that other people cannot. Jamie has more of a, we have this super trained team that they know how to deconstruct arguments. They're gonna have the power to do it. And there's no crowdsourcing contributions whatsoever. Timothy has more of let's only allow canonical claims, which is still open for definition. But so the whole argument modeling will be restricted to only allow canonical claims. And then Marc-Antoine, you have more of this, what if we have all these different arguments modeled in a federated architecture? Like, can we create some algorithms to start combining these, pulling them together? And can we start calculating equivalence relations between them? So you can see these are different approaches. But what is come to all of them is that what comes out of that process, out of that curation process, is we want to represent an argument. So that's why if you look at the arrows between the curation bounded contexts and argument modeling, I consider curation to be downstream, that's what the D means, of argument modeling, meaning the results, the choices made during curation will have to fundamentally make changes within the argument model. Like what can be curated in the first place depends fully on what you decide to model, because the actions that you model are the ones that you'll eventually use to make changes. Whether or not it's a single person deciding to make those changes, a crowdsourced group, a group of Society Library people, that's the commonality between it, which is why I identify this as a clear bounded context, in my opinion. Now, CDL has a greater purpose than only doing argument modeling. And I think that's where things might have gotten lost in translation. Whenever in previous discussion we said this is out of scope for the current discussion, I think using this diagram, a better way to formulate that is, right now we're focusing on argument modeling. We're not focusing on curation right now. And given the complexity of previous situations, so I also suggest to create a separate glossary for argument modeling than curation, because I think it will allow us to focus more on one aspect of the bigger problem, to decompose the problem. And because argument modeling is upstream of curation, it's also the first one we should focus on. I think that's a summary. At this point, I said a lot, so maybe I should open it up to questions.
First, Stephen, I just want to say thank you so much for going through all the discovery process and the work of creating this model, discovering the model, creating the specific model. Thank you for trying to take all of the persistent, I don't want to say conflict, but for lack of a better word, like conflicting ideas, and trying to apply order to it. So thank you for that. With that being said, I do want to say that there's probably some uncoupling, at least for the Society Library, because the modeling of argumentation to a certain degree happens through curation. I don't want to overcomplicate things, so maybe like everyone should just give their round of reactions. But I will say that like good start, maybe worth visualizing in this way, but there's probably many more bubbles.
Definitely. But the intent is to create the bubbles collaboratively, start thinking about the bubbles collaboratively, primarily driven from identifying use cases. And then as for each team saying, yes, these are the use cases we want, these are the ones we might disagree on. And then we can redraw this entire diagram, preferably collaboratively.
Cool.
I'd like to let others go first because, yeah, I'll go on for a long time.
I don't know that I have much to add. I think it's helpful to discuss this. I don't know. I guess I'm happy going down this path. I would still think that regardless of the different bounding contexts, if we focused on the parts of the model that we think most everyone would agree with, and know that we're going to have to model things that and I'm specifically talking about like back on the ERD model and stuff like that. If we know that we're going to model things that we're going to have to change when we plug in these other needs, which are expressed in this context, which this has the same concept, right? Because the argument model we create just for the argument model will not work for, will have to be changed in order to get some of those other features in there. I'd still, even after this, maybe people focus on when you're bringing in a new concept into the argument model or whatever we're working on at the time, to try and let's propose and agree on which concept we think is most agreed upon, rather than focusing on the disagreements and still introduce one concept at a time, just to make it digestible. But this is a way to do it.
I fully agree, but the point of contention there, I think, always has been figuring out which one we can agree on and figuring out which one is more important than the other one. And I think these types of diagrams, they allow to do that, because each entity you introduce, actually shortly with Felix, I don't think I summarized that. We we talked about suggesting a process where for each new entity that's introduced as part of our modeling efforts, we explicitly always link them back to use cases, like user stories.
Not only entities, in general, or generalizations to the model, because this is very relevant to Marc-Antoine. It's not just about adding entities.
I think it's relevant for everyone by formulating them as user stories. For example, for me right now, one of the main reasons why I want to do argument modeling is, as a developer, why I want to talk about the argument modeling bounded context is, for me as a developer, I want to be able to load an argument and represent it in a graphical user interface. That is one of the user stories that I want right now. And we can extend on that. It's something different than saying, oh, well, the argument modeling is actually a whole system which you can upload arguments to. Then I would start saying, well, that's actually a different bounded context, because which system? So it should be smaller than that.
Yeah, I just want, when I was saying concepts, so argument modeling is made up of 10, 20, 100 concepts. And I guess the problem I saw in the previous discussions was that we would introduce 10 concepts, and then people would naturally pick the ones that are, you know, we would focus on the disagreements because that's what people see. When if you're, what I'm suggesting may not even be possible because concepts has a huge variance in size and overlapping. But yeah, anyways, that's just my raw thoughts.
My, can you bring the diagram back, please?
Okay, sorry.
Or unless Felix, you want to go?
I'm good. You can go.
Okay. When you say upstream, downstream, I'm a bit curious. You said you don't want the, basically when you say downstream, the needs of the downstream shouldn't go to the upstream, right?
No, that's not true. Okay, so at this point it might, yeah, so there's a couple of different relations possible in bounded context diagrams. These
okay, let's go through those. I'm curious. Yeah.
Relationships as they are technical dependencies. A customer-supplier relationship specifically is, now I have to open something different. Trying to find a nice summary of the different relationships. I chose that one explicitly, but I didn't want to go into too much detail.
I mean, you're introducing a language. We'll have to master the language. It will take time.
It takes. It's really not that. I'll just share the diagram again. I can't find a good source immediately. It's really not that complicated. I mean, it's a one-pager you can read. There's only a couple of different relations. You can notice this one says partnership. This means that it's assumed that there's a super close collaboration between requirements between these two bounded contexts, between my website and how I want to do curation on the website. It's going to be super interlinked. There's no real up or downstream definition here. A shared kernel is an explicit point to say there's code reuse.
Okay.
So
that's clear.
There will be overlapping code between the two. That's what I think we're aiming for with CDL. Customer supplier means simply that the dependencies, in a technical way, they point. It's the curation systems that depend on the argument modeling system.
Yeah, but it's still possible. It's still possible for the dependent models like reputation-based curation to have an impact on the argument modeling design.
Exactly.
Because
so that's why there's also different dependencies that are, I think they're called. There's also different links where you say, well, there's not even any input you can give to change the downstream. I think they're called conformist. Yes.
Yeah. I saw the video, by the way.
Okay.
So
no, it's not a conformist relationship. Of course, if there are, and we said it many times, if there are use cases in the curation domain, which we do think are in scope of the whole CDL project, that impact how things should be modeled in the argument modeling bounded context, we do need to talk about those, of course. So that's what it means to have a customer-supplier relationship.
Yeah. That was my example of you cannot think HTTP over UDP.
Exactly. But what it still does mean, the fact that it's represented as a separate bounded context, is that it is different language we use. It's going to be different UML diagrams we draw. It's going to be different use cases we want to support within those bounded contexts. That's why the decoupling happens to keep the discussion focused.
Fair enough. I think that's perfectly reasonable. And constraints can travel, but we want to separate the modeling. That's perfectly reasonable.
Constraints can travel, but then they should be expressed as use cases within.
Absolutely.
And I think that's what we need to do more of. Like when you want to introduce new entities, which is totally valid because you think you need them, we just need to make very sure they link back to use cases. And then we can have a discussion whether or not everyone agrees these are use cases we want to handle in this bounded context.
Right. And when there's a very fundamental dependency, and I keep giving the example of databases modeling, right? Like whether I choose graph or relational database, that's a fundamental dependency because everything will depend on that. I'm giving that as an example. How do you represent that as something customer supplier or more fundamental? Like if we're speaking about the modeling paradigm.
I think you're concretely. So it helps to define the use cases again in this discussion, because we're not talking about concrete systems right now. If you look at how I try to define argument modeling on Slack, I call it provide a formal way to model real-world arguments and relate them to one another. You can see that there's no provide a way to store arguments centrally in a database bound context. I think that is a context.
Okay.
So discussing how to model it should be separated from the database for that reason, because these are dependencies you don't want to pull into the actual modeling efforts.
Yeah. And the problem we keep having is you keep putting arguments at the center of the model.
Yeah,
right?
That's interesting. So another thing that domain-driven design advocates, if you read some of the sources,
Yes, I did.
Identify the core domain.
Yeah.
Core domain is the thing like, why are you building this in the first place, right? Why aren't we using the argument interchange format? Why aren't we just using
that's a good question.
And that is because, in my opinion, argument modeling is the core domain. That is why we're all talking about this right now. And that's also why it should receive the most love and attention out of the entire project. And that's also why I think Jamie offered up to spend some of her meeting hours allocated weekly to actually doing that.
Yep.
A cross-cutting concern.
Absolutely. But the question is always, my metaphor of doing organic chemistry without carbon. It's not because we want to do organic chemistry and that's our goal that we can dispense with atomic modeling, right?
No.
And
I agree there. I think I might have been a bit short on that before when I said, oh, but that's out of scope. I think what I simply mean is it's a different bound context. And I think it would benefit if we spend maybe next meeting on trying to see, is it a bounded context? Can we agree on that? If so, how are they interdependent and where do we draw the line between
and I don't think it's a bounded context, and that's the whole contention, right? Yeah, like exactly. It's easy to have a bounded context when it happens above. But for me, see, for example, yes, you can define argument modeling as a bounded context out of concept modeling in my mind, right? The way you do chemistry out of atomic, out of atoms. You do molecular biology out of molecules, but putting, biology is a bounded context of chemistry. But doing it the other way around poses issues.
So,
and the other example I have is if you do, I'm still thinking molecules, sorry, I have chemistry on my mind. If you do when you do 3D modeling of molecules, at some point you'll want a 2D model of the molecule because that's easier to draw. Or it's what you want to put on a screen. You want to do a 2D projection. But it's not because you want a 2D projection that the 2D projection is the fundamental data structure.
So it's really interesting you bring this up because that's exactly the problem.
Yes, it is.
You're talking about modeling the world. And if you see at one of the sources I linked to,
yeah, I heard.
We're not modeling the world. We're modeling business use cases, and that's why we
absolutely
need use cases. Use case defined.
And I gave the use case. The use case is to identify similar arguments using their components rather than always at the argument level to reduce the combinatoric complexity. I said that. That was my use case.
And I think you both don't disagree there.
No, I'm disagreeing. It's a use case within argument modeling.
Ah,
No.
Referring to
I'm saying it's fundamental to argument modeling. That's where we disagree. Yeah, that's really the point of disagreement.
Fundamental to argument modeling model-wise or to a use case?
To the use case, I'm saying when we want to say these two arguments are the same, we can do it directly, and that's valid. We can do it, but I'm saying there's a huge number of arguments, there's a huge number of sentences, and we'll get lost in the combinatorial complexity of just how many possible arguments there are. I'm not saying it's wrong to do it, and sometimes it's useful to do it as a bootstrap, but I'm saying as much as possible, we want to bring that bootstrap to decomposed arguments in terms of the component claims and the claims in terms of component entities, because then we can use the bootstrap of entity equivalence to determine argument equivalence.
Okay, so maybe the use case is that we need to have a modeling mechanism so as to handle like vast volumes of information that will need to be coupled and deduplicated. Exactly. Okay, so that would be the use case, is that we need to have a mechanism to digest and couple that. Because like as you were talking, I was thinking, well, the Society Library has a different use case, right? Because we have a different strategy for how we couple things and deduplicate. So we don't have to be overwhelmed with volume because we're not trying to match entities in, like we don't need to like match up all of the lines, the millions of lines of text that we got donated from someone who scraped a bunch of TV for us. We just need to find those within the millions. We don't need to combine all the millions. Nor do we have to handle people trying to collaborate, like collaboratively put together millions.
Once again, you have the millions, right?
Yes, we have the millions.
What I'm saying is you can identify the millions more easily. There's already a combinatorial layer there because it's a combination of the entities and the claims. And if you identify the entities and the claims, it makes it easier to handle the millions.
But Marc-Antoine, you're focusing very much on implementation details again. So exactly.
No, that's not an implementation detail. That's a use case.
It does seem like it's a use case.
It is a use case.
Whose perspective can you formulate as a user story? As X, I want to.
As someone who is trying to deduplicate claims and handle the fact that I have millions of claims that I find on the net, I want to not handle the claims one by one. And it's easier, and hence I want a mechanism to, if I identify the entities and the entities have been previously identified, I want that to translate into claim identification. I want to be able to identify claim automatically, given that I manually identify it into entities that have been manually identified previously.
But can you boil it down to the core use case? Like, because you said someone, but can you make it a concrete one? Who is the someone?
Can I just add to that? Because Marc-Antoine we actually agree entirely. That's not like a current operation of Society Library, but that is a desired use case. So I can give a very specific example as to how this like plays out in the real world. So like as a member of the Society Library, one of our data donors takes a list of keywords, which are essentially entities, and they scrape years worth of television with those keywords being present in that. It's like 700 keywords we gave them. Having received that list of parsed out sentences that contain these keywords, I would love to have a mechanism, which is just some data science magic, to be able to couple these sentences by their relevance given the other entities present, which would be other keywords or different pieces of language or whatever, to identify what is most likely to be seen as a similar claim expressing the same sentiment. That's a real like use case of something we want to have access to, because right now we have to just wade through and pluck one out, but it would save us a lot of time and give us a lot more deduplicated data if we actually did identify things down to the entity level.
And if you want me to show it, I'll do it on the 3D diagram, not on the 2D projection.
Just a quick statement. That is not an immediate goal of my systems.
Fair enough. Not everybody has the same use cases.
Yeah.
No, exactly. And so I don't think we need to agree right now. We do. I'm just suggesting as a process moving forward, we need to be better at identifying them, writing them down, and
Yeah.
agreeing on which use cases we agree on.
One thing I will agree with, and I do understand, is that it's perfectly valid for your applications to say, this is out of the scope of my application, and I want to be able to have a 2D projection that I can manipulate without worrying about 3D entities. That's a fair use case. That's a perfectly valid one, and one I agree on. But I do still think that thinking that we'll have a good model by putting the molecules at the center is going to be a mistake long term, and we need to have a model of the atoms.
That's the whole thing. The model should be tailored to the use cases, and
and I gave the use case, and Jamie agreed. It's a use case. It may not be your use case, but it's a use case.
Wait, but like Stephen, we talked. You can see my screen, right?
Yeah.
The diagram. Yes. Stephen, we both talked about this one, and what we came up with a question we wanted to ask you, Marc-Antoine.
Yeah.
Well, this is a perfect example, exactly, because what started my whole discussion on Hangouts was the symbol relation we shortly talked about in the last meeting as well, that I said this does not fit within my understanding of a bounded context of argument modeling, because symbol relation specifically is not what I consider a use case of argument modeling, because, well, it is, but not as a separate entity, because, and I'll give you the word, Marc-Antoine. What is the use case that you envision for introducing a symbol relation entity?
I told you it is as a way to
no, which user, like a use case?
No, but this is the wrong diagram.
Okay.
Like let's have the full diagram, please. Do you have it, Felix, or should I pull it out?
Please share it, Marc-Antoine.
Yeah. Well, let me take it out.
So, Stephen, is there a specific way in which we would go about communicating it? Like when we did user story mapping, we said, as a user, I need to do this, as an archivist, do this.
That's the way. And I would say, like, everyone should write user stories that they believe we're trying to do within this bounded context. So the thing that we, as Bentley suggested, we can most likely all agree on. Everyone can add user stories to those. I would just create a document. We can add some homework, I think, at the end of the meeting. And then we start listing these, and then we can start saying, yes, I agree. These are the user stories that are within the realm of argument modeling. These other ones are points of contention, and then we can take it from there.
Okay, and then Marc-Antoine, do you think that your disagreement about the process could be grounded in us exploring the process itself? So like when we actually arrive at delineating the bounded context and adding sticky notes to it or whatever the model is, do you think that while we're going through the process, you could bring up the points of contention of where the process would fail? Because I think that would make most sense, because we're dealing with new concepts here. So it's like very abstract and like high level to like be seeing disagreements. So for me, I think it would be very beneficial to just try delineating these bounded contexts. I love the idea of use cases because it really makes concrete like what we're looking to do and why it's useful and why we want it. And then Marc-Antoine, if as we go, you just identify like, see here, this is where this would fail, or this will get us into trouble, or this is inadequate, that would make me understand it so much more quickly than speaking in the abstract, because this is a new frame of thinking for me. And I'm excited to learn about it because I think it's really practical. But I'm totally open to like it not being the frame that can help us solve our disagreements or accurately map the territory. So I would love if we could just move forward with it in that way. And Stephen, you've done a lot of reading on this, so
I've been applying this for 4 years.
Yeah, so I'd love for you to take us through it. It seems like a wonderful learning opportunity.
It's
and
working.
As long as
I work with like 2 different organizations, and we have to work on the same project. We have different ideas of what should be shared. We're using the same code base both in research and in industry, so I had to find some framework to navigate all of it. And that's how I stumbled upon domain-driven design.
There's a lot to say for domain-driven design, by the way. I mean, in a way, it is what I'm trying to do with topic mapping, saying, you know, people have different vocabularies. We need to unify the vocabularies, and we need to have different projections of knowledge onto bounded domains. I mean, right now I'm working on having a kind of, okay, suppose you want to talk to a topic map through GraphQL. So you're using types, GraphQL types, as a lens on data that is not necessarily bounded by types, but you're using types as a lens because that's what you understand. And doing that mapping is interesting, but what I'm doing there is I'm allowing the same entity to be describable by many types according to which lens you're using, to which domain you're starting from. But for me, the data is not in the types only, because each type can come with different attributes for a given thing.
But that misunderstands the fundamental aspect of bound context and DDD, and that is that these should be separate systems. So the whole point is to decouple that complexity, that a database that stores argument modeling concepts is not dependent on any technical implementations, conceptual considerations of an external system.
And that is an assumption I disagree about. The notion
it's not about
that
dependency, it's just like the design of these external systems influences the design on the argumentation model. It doesn't mean it has a technical dependency.
Exactly.
Yeah, but that is one thing I vaguely disagree about. It's that there's always dependency presuppositions. Now, it's true that you can do things at an abstract level where you try to abstract things, but you're not guaranteed to succeed to abstract things from the technical level. It's just people do it, and it works in most cases because people use usually the same paradigms. What do you mean by
abstract things? Because I think what we're arguing for is to have less abstractions and have more concrete bounded context. It's the opposite.
Yes. I don't want us to persist in our disagreements at the abstract level. I'm down for use cases, and I think we can talk about the things that we're talking about currently in the abstraction through a use case concrete.
And I just did.
Framework.
And I just did.
Well, I'm interested in like the actual process, because even like language itself is an abstraction. Like as we are talking, and I'm abstracting and inferring meaning from just even how you're speaking. So I think that to even concretize, like if that's not a word, to make more concrete the expressions that we have, like actually putting it into written language, organizing it in a physical space, color coding it with stickies, I think would make it so much easier and productive to actually deal with those disagreements, because we'll be actually creating physical boundaries and physical representation of the communication, as opposed to conversation where I'm abstracting 3 layers deep by the time like the information gets to my mind. Did
you see the videos of our last conversations?
I think I watched one of them, not in its entirety. I've been really busy. Listen, guys, I've been getting a crash course on kicking butt and fundraising. I'm very excited and very confident for Q1. So, stay tuned. But I'm, here with the team, but no, I haven't seen the previous arguments.
Fair enough. No, and a lot of it was very technical. I'm just curious.
I have another comment on bounded context, just based on the short exchange. It's important to know that bounded context model verticals, as in one bounded context is the entire vertical underneath it, from database to domain model to content, depending on what the bounded context is, because the exact bounded context I'm suggesting right now for argument modeling is not a system, it's a library you can use to build other systems. So if there's no persistence, then of course there's also no persistence within the on context. Although
I always talk about database, but it's not so much because I'm bringing persistence. I'm bringing the fact that different databases have different paradigms.
Yes,
like modeling paradigms.
Context is that you pick the database that's the best thing to store for that ubiquitous language and concepts. And when I say verticals, it is verticals. The point is that when we talk about requirements with Jamie and use cases, those are the exact same things, but also represented in the database, in the code base, in everything.
And at that level, I do agree. But I'm saying there are a lot of assumptions we have about that come from our habit of using certain paradigms that end up being not so obvious when you do the modeling.
But that's true. So your point is that the use cases you want to support are better off using a more abstract model.
Yes. Well, a more atomic model.
Yes.
Using
to make that concrete, to make this a fruitful discussion, because we've been having this discussion a lot of times.
Yep.
You need to bring out. Well, we can do that together. We need to consider what those use cases are, write them down, and discuss the use.
Yep. And my use case, I said it. It's I want to decompose arguments into claims and claims into entities.
Let's start maybe by writing that somewhere.
Let's write it down. Yeah, writing it down.
Who's screen sharing?
I am.
Maybe first of all, where are we going to do this? I suggest to do it in the glossary thing, because if those use cases we agree on, either way, the glossary would represent those use cases.
And the use cases probably use vocabulary of the glossary.
And all the abstractions are in service of that use case. Like, what's a thought proxy or topic? And forget topics. It's been renamed to thought proxy, or one meaning of topic.
Let's take it one step at a time, shall we?
Yes.
So I'll call this use cases for argument modeling right now.
Okay.
And let's just start with that and see what happens.
Yeah.
So for me, the main one that I said before is, as a developer, I want to, like, let's say, load a argument graph so that I can render it in a user interface. Like that's my use case. Like everyone that's currently here, do we agree this is part of an argument modeling use case we want to support?
Totally.
Yes.
I have something to add.
Yeah, although I suggest for each one we don't ask for agreement on everyone. Let's just write down our proposals.
Yeah, but let's just test this right now, right? I think this is an easy one.
A small precision, which I expect we'll all agree on, in different user interfaces, because we may not have the same one, but the user interfaces we each have in mind are all valid.
But so I think that's implied by in user stories, a developer is a category of user.
Cool.
So it's any developer.
Yeah, okay, I think it's fine. In a user interface of my own designing.
Can I suggest one? I just want to make sure I'm on the same page in terms of the scope of argument modeling.
Yes.
As a curator, I want to structure argumentation as an inquiry into the truth.
What does an inquiry, what do you mean by that?
Yeah,
good question. So it's essentially, gosh, it's hard to explain. So at the Society Library, we look at a bunch of argumentation. We find the fundamental questions that encompass all of these debates, right? So instead of just randomly picking a question saying this applies to climate change, instead we look at like a lot of different claims and arguments and say, oh, okay, there's these categories of arguments that keep happening. Those categories of arguments all fall into certain debates about a certain subtopic. And when we keep like regressing to that higher level point of view, we notice, oh, all of these debates actually point to some fundamental questions.
Okay,
and then
so you
we
want to cluster arguments into fundamental questions.
There we
That's
go. Yeah, we
case.
could just make it, cluster it into fundamental questions.
Something along those lines, maybe?
Something along those lines. It doesn't have to
I
be
think the word cluster should be there.
Cluster's a good one.
so that I can identify clusters of so that I can cluster them into fundamental questions, or I can group them in clusters related to fundamental questions.
Yeah, because the identifying of the questions is actually in the analysis process. So cluster under fundamental questions is works.
Maybe that's two use cases actually. One is to create clusters, and the second is to identify the fundamental question in the cluster.
On the
What do you
what
think, Jamie? Question. That's a question.
Yeah, I'm lost. Can somebody repeat?
Okay, no, but the
As
question
a
to Jamie.
curator, I
Mhm.
want to structure argumentation so that
You know, when they identify clusters of arguments.
yeah, that works. Yeah, as clusters as opposed to debates specifically, because debates means a specific thing. As a curator, I want to identify clusters of arguments
That's what it is.
to structure it.
So that's what it is. So the interesting bit, if you write it like this, it becomes a whole lot clearer that what you're actually doing is you're clustering arguments. Then the question is, what is an argument, right?
No, but I had a question, Jamie.
Mhm.
Do you do clustering and then look for a question? And is that two use cases? Like you
Yeah.
identify clusters and then try to find a question, or is the clustering guided by the identification of questions as you cluster?
Like, do you come up with the question first and then put stuff into this?
Or along,
No.
or can they be totally separated? Could you imagine doing all the clustering first and then doing the question identification, or is
Yes.
that wrong?
No,
Okay,
that's precisely the method, actually. The method is to cluster and then derive questions. So actually, and the clustering and identification is outside the scope of argument modeling. That's really an analysis that we do. So as a curator, I want to structure arguments to debate each other, essentially. I want to we don't need to put analysis in argument modeling because I think it is a little bit different. Unless
no, I think the clustering is still part of argument modeling. It's the question identification that isn't.
Use cases. So as a curator, I want to
structure arguments to debate with each other. Just that. Into debates. I want to structure.
Stephen, you put the clustering into analysis. I don't think it belongs in analysis as Jamie described it.
Yeah.
What belongs in analysis is identifying the questions of the cluster. That's different.
Sometimes it's hard for me to think on the fly. As a curator, I want to structure arguments for their for their relevance to each other and as a way of modeling a debate about whether something is true or not.
How about, Jamie, tell me if that reflects it. I want to identify relationships between arguments.
Sure. Yeah, that works.
When you say I want to structure arguments, is that very different than saying I want to create an argument graph? Just to use the same things here?
We could say, as a curator, I want to curate an argument graph. I think that we could make argument graph imply that there is structure. So
yeah, we have to define
whatever
it
the
that
structure is could be like a more specific use case.
Well, I think it depends on when you say I want to structure arguments, the next question, of course, is what does that mean? And I'm just inferring here from knowing debate map that you are actually creating an argument graph.
Yes, we are creating.
Why don't you just call it argument structure?
Yeah.
Leave the graph word.
The reason why I prefer to write it like that is one, it reuses entities we've already identified.
Yeah, that's fair.
Two, DDD really advocates being very clear on you operate on things rather than you say the whole process is structuring arguments, right? But you're trying to decompose that into what does that mean? So I want to, let's say, create.
Okay, can I, sorry. I proposed the definition, and Jamie agreed, of identifying relationships between arguments. The notion of structuring arguments can be confusing because it can also mean identifying the structure of arguments, which is a totally different thing.
I hear you.
And so I would not use the word structure arguments. I would say create the graph, or then say identify relationships between arguments, because this is what creating the graph is. It's creating, unless I'm mistaken, is that what you understand by create the argument graph? Identify, I think it's equivalent to identify relationship between arguments. First question, really. Yeah, forget true or not, that is something else.
The society, yeah, I mean, the society library, our specific use case is that after we've looked at all these claims, clustered them, find the fundamental questions, we then model all of that argumentation relevant to the questions and inquiring into what position that answers the question is true. So it's a very specific way of structuring knowledge. It's not just whatever's relevant can be argued about. Like there's a very specific hierarchical, we are inquiring into the truth of something. And the reason why we found that structure is because the questions have emerged. So it's a very specific ontology that we're talking about.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to communicate that. It's hard to communicate that though.
I think
I need to find a one-liner for that to make that
what we're trying
understandable.
to discern here, and we can go into details. It would help if other people also actually just write their own use cases rather than me trying to go on the fly and having
Sure.
to.
Yeah, fair enough.
Yeah.
I think what I'm identifying is that the so that might be different. It might be so that we can structure them with questions. It might be so that I can render them in a user interface. But what is common, I think, if we go deeper into this exercise, is that we actually all want to model arguments, and that can be creating them, can be linking one argument to another, it can be adding underlying sentences, etc. We can do this in more detail.
Yeah.
But I think for now, I actually want to focus on what we probably don't agree on, and those are the use cases that Marc-Antoine was suggesting, I think.
One second, Jamie. I think that having a one-liner for this is an anti-goal. I think you have many use cases. You have a whole process, and each step of the process should be a use case. And think of it as decomposing it into steps. And this is why determines whether something is true or not. I think it's a very bad use case. I think you're trying to find relationship between arguments, and maybe you should say only those relationships are the ones that are relevant to my goals. That you may want to restrict the notion of arguments. Then the next step is clustering using those relationships. Then the next step is finding the relevant question. Then the next step is how do you use the relationship to the question as a way to identify and I don't know what's the next step for you because I don't know your methodology in depth, but I'm trying to get you to think of it as different things, because if you say whether something is true or not, that is it's not an actionable use case as defined.
Fair.
And truth, I'm fascinated to have the conversation with you about truth and how
we've had it. We never determine what's true, but we argue as model, like we structure the argumentation so the arguments themselves are arguing about what's true, but we don't determine what's true. But we've had the conversation, happy to have it again. But let's move on to disagreements because we know how spirited those are.
Yeah. Okay. So as something, and we need to detail that, I want to find relationships between arguments so that
relationship. What is a relationship? Because that's going to depend fully on the use case. I mean, does it use the same word? Which will probably depend on the ... here.
That's a good point. There's maybe each relationship will be a distinct use case and a distinct story. That's entirely possible. So for example, as a curator, I want to identify equivalent arguments to unify them.
To find similar arguments.
Equivalent, that's different.
Find equivalent arguments. I want to find equivalents and then arguments so that
I can identify them. So to reduce the total number of arguments.
Finding them. You've identified them, then what? Why are you identifying them? What's the use case? What do you want
the use case is reducing the total number of arguments.
So that's the total number of arguments and it's really important to add that last part always.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree totally. Yeah.
So how do you reduce the number of arguments, and what are these number of arguments?
Yeah, well, this is
represented or modeled, if you see where I'm headed.
Totally. In your, well, not in your, in mine too. That's the distinction between declarative sentence and claim, right? We find equivalent, we draw an equivalence relation between two declarative sentence, and hence, if they were on different claims, we unify the underlying claims. That's the model level, but I don't think that's the question you wanted me to
No,
answer.
I'm saying, how are you gonna do this? So you've now found an equivalent argument.
Yeah, and I
First
tell the
of all,
system
what-
those two are equivalent. Please consider them
Where
equivalent.
have you found the equivalent arguments? Like in an argument graph, like where do I identify it? Right?
Yeah. Well,
In an
I
argument
presume
model?
there's a UX that gives me access to the set of sentences that are in the system.
Yes. So somewhere there's an argument that has been modeled.
Yes.
My point is, within that model, you want to find equivalent arguments
Yes.
and then reduce it, change the
Yes.
model.
Yes.
So you want to operate on an argument model and change the argument model, correct?
Yeah. That in that restricted projection, yes.
So that's why I call it a dependency from curation on the argument modeling. It operates entirely on the argument model.
By the way, argument here is undefined, right? We agree that we should be speaking about claims and declarative sentences.
Yes, yeah, fully. So I think as we have like deeper potential discrepancies on whether or not these are different use cases, we should probably break them up and.
Yeah. But yeah, and of course, as a curator, and then maybe I should get in, if we want to get into disagreement, then there's the next step, right?
Well, I think this is the main one that was under disagreement. I think
no, that's the part we agree on.
Use case, because I think this is the use case that you bring forward why you want to model entity relations in argument modeling, if I understand correctly.
That is correct. It's part. It's yeah.
Maybe Felix, can you share your screen again?
With the diagram, you mean?
Yeah.
Sec. Yeah, sharing the screen produces a lot of noise. Okay. There you go. You can see it?
Yeah. So to go back to why we're talking about use cases was to make sure that we can all discuss and point to specific use cases why you're introducing certain things in what we believe is to be the model that supports use cases we want to support. So whenever you model something, it needs to be linked to use case. So am I correct to understand that symbol relation in this model is intended to support the use case? As a curator, I want to find equivalent arguments so that the total number of arguments can be reduced.
It's one of the two ways in which I intend to support that use case, yes. It's not the only way, but it's one way.
Okay. So I think the question here is what I said before. It's like, how do you find equivalent arguments, and what is an argument in that case?
What I'm saying is, as a curator, I'm identifying, and there's a lot of hand waving about the specific UX, but it's still, the operation is very clear. I have a declarative sentence standing for a claim. I have another declarative sentence standing for another claim.
Declarative sentence and claims you're talking about right now.
What?
The declarative sentence and claim you're talking about right now, do you agree that is part of argument modeling? Like that can probably be linked back to use cases of, as a argument mapper, I want to add a declarative sentence to a claim.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
And those two declarative sentences, I will say they're equivalent so that there is at least one claim in common. There should be at least one claim in common for the many-to-many relationship of those declarative sentences. And I may actually be unifying all the claims of declarative sentence, or a subset, it depends. I mean, maybe that.
Okay, you're jumping quite quickly again.
Yeah. There's a lot hidden there, yes.
And I think the hidden part is exactly why we might disagree on whether or not it should be a separate bounded context.
No, at that level, within the bounded context. As I said, there's one part that lives totally within your bounded context. Mechanism 2 doesn't, but mechanism 1 does. So let's talk about it within the bounded context.
No, but we're trying to identify the bounded context. The problem is we're not agreed on the context
No,
is.
totally. I think this is the wrong place to draw the boundary, and that's the whole point of contention. That's why we disagree on from the beginning. Yes, we know that.
So I imagine within my argument modeling context, I imagine use cases like, as an argument mapper, I want to add a declarative declarative sentence, and I should actually write this down, to a claim to indicate that the set of declarative sentences related to that claim are equivalent.
Yeah, you could do that. That's perfectly fine.
That is my use case. So I want to say all these declarative sentences actually refer to the same claim. They are the same
That's
claim.
a perfectly valid use case, yes.
Okay. Now you have a use case where you say, as a curator, I want to find equivalent arguments, but let's make it more concrete. We're talking about equivalence of a sentence here.
Here
So
in your use case, you were starting from claim and declarative sentence, and then you're saying I'm adding declarative sentence. Here I'm saying some curator did claim declarative sentence, claim declarative sentence. They didn't look for an existing claim. They did it wrong, or it comes from another data set or whatever. And now we want to do this fusion a posteriori, post hoc, and that's a use case. And so what I'm doing is I'm first drawing the equivalence relation between the two sentences to say those claims should be fused. So that's my.
But there's two use cases here, and that's where we disagree. There's two use cases. One is fusing them, and that's the use case within argument modeling. As an argument mapper, I want to combine two claims so they share the same declarative sentences and that they're just one claim. That's one use case I consider to be argument modeling.
Yeah.
What you're saying is, as curator, I want to indicate that two declarative sentences and two separate claims are probably equivalent or are equivalent.
Yeah.
What I'm saying is the outcome of that use case might be that you fuse them, but who decides that? So what you're talking about is a use case of saying they are the same. Whereas what I find in scope of argument modeling is enacting on those decisions, because one person might say they're the same, another person might say they're different. That's what I call the curation bounded context.
Okay, fair enough. And I agree with that, by the way. I agree that identifying the relations, identical, different, precision. For me, precision is an important symbol relation. I had an enum in the other diagram for those three cases. There might be more, but at least those three. Like this claim is more precise than that claim. I think that's an important relation. And actually, I'd be curious for Jamie to extend.
Let's focus on equivalence.
Yeah. But let's focus on equivalent. Someone may say they're equivalent. Someone may say they're not equivalent. So that's one use case. It's declaring equivalence at the sentence level.
No, it's declaring. It's declaring changes that need to happen to what is currently modeled. Because wouldn't you say in the other use cases where you add declarative sentences to claims, you already model equivalence? If you have three declarative sentences added to a claim, you model that they're equivalent. So
that's correct.
Now you're suggesting to introduce in the domain model to also model the symbol relations, but what they actually are people that say that the model is wrong.
Yes.
Which is a different use case. It's an external system, and that's where we differ. You might want to say that. I might, Jamie might just want to say, well, these couple of people, they have access to change the argument map. It depends on that's why to me it's a different bound context.
Okay. No, I think it's the same use case because it is about maintaining the claim. No, listen, hear me out. I think it is about maintaining the claim declarative sentence relations, right? We're trying to maintain those relations and we're trying to give signals for these relations. One signal is manipulating directly, the other signal is manipulating indirectly. But the use case is to curate the claim declarative sentence many-to-many relation.
But a bound context is a consistency boundary. So that means that all the data that lives within it is consistent. What does it mean in your model if you have modeled a claim with two underlying declarative sentences and another claim with two underlying declarative sentences, and you have one symbol relation between two of these declarative sentences saying they are the same? In what way is this domain still consistent, and what is it actually modeling?
Very good question. for me, consistency is something you achieve through negotiation. I do not.
But wait.
No. This is important. This is extremely important.
Yeah,
I
know where you headed.
What?
You're talking about
good,
two different
good.
things,
I know where
two
you're headed.
different concepts of consistency.
Exactly.
Yeah,
No.
totally.
Okay, good.
Exactly. If I'm a single user modeling arguments,
Yes.
the argument model I modeled is consistent. If I want to make changes to it, I change it. You're talking
Yes.
about what I labeled in the bound context diagram, some more federated form of curation.
Yes.
Yes, which is not a use case we all share.
Fair enough.
Well, I'm telling you, I don't share. That's not my focus.
No. That's that. No. Fair enough. You don't share it. That's
right now.
a statement.
Right now.
Yeah.
I'm saying that there are different mechanisms of doing this, and for me, that's reason enough to consider it a separate bound context.
Okay.
Because we don't want to limit the whole argument modeling exercises because we might disagree on some other tangential things which can be decoupled either way.
And my point is that the notion of a claim is, I defined it pretty much as the equivalence class of the equivalence relation. It's how, like, decoupling the claim from the symbol relation is.
But we're not disagreeing with that, Marc-Antoine. I'm not disagreeing with that. I'm saying the equivalence relation is modeled by the mere fact that you model a relation between a claim that's composed of declarative sentences. That is the equivalence relation. It's there. What we're not modeling is potential disagreement on whether or not that's correct or not. That's what I consider outside of for this bounded context.
That is fair. Okay, putting the symbol relation outside. What does it mean? No, what does it entail?
We just, while walking through this case of symbol relation, you indicated that this is not just a symbol relation. This is somebody making a relation across different claims, saying these two are actually the same. It's not like saying these two that are already part of a claim are the same, because that's already modeled within a claim. The use case is entirely different. One is argument modeling. The other one is objecting that an argument is currently modeled correctly.
The reason I'm resisting, I'm hearing you, but the reason I'm resisting is I do not believe that much of that, you're speaking of the direct manipulation of the claim declarative sentence.
Yes.
I don't believe in UX terms it will ever happen much outside of symbol relation manipulation. I think that the UX mechanism will be symbol manipulation.
No, necessarily.
And that may be wrong, but
no disagreement there. But we're not talking UX because the scope of my suggested argument modeling bound context does not even involve UX. It's a library you can use to implement things.
And I'm saying, and I'm saying, and you agreed up to a point. I said it needs to be exposed. It's if we expose it, why not expose it in the main model? And
what needs to be exposed?
The symbol relation. I made the point exposing the symbol relation makes sense because there may be curation that is cross-model. And you said that was a straw man because you said, I didn't say I didn't want it to exist or be exposed or be modeled. Again, fair enough, that's correct.
I'm only arguing it's a different bound context. Yes, symbol relation as you describe it in use case might be relevant. I'm only arguing I want to keep that in a separate bound context, which I call curation. And we can also have separate meetings with separate glossaries to work towards a shared curation model. There's no disagreement there. And definitely if you want to move towards not having silos of like one argumentation system and another with disconnected databases, which I think nobody at CDL wants, we also need to start talking about a shared curation model. No disagreement there. I'm suggesting that the curation model depends on first having a shared argument model and having a separate focused discussion on the latter before we try to do the former is really going to help us.
Right. No. So, and fair enough. My last point, and by the way, this is something I did say, we can't separate them. I still see the point of modeling it. And you said, yeah, fair enough. Okay, we had this discussion. I still say it's easier to explain what a claim is, what a claim, but I don't think claim is the proper unit of explanation, by the way. I still diverge with you on that. But it's easier to explain the notion of equivalence relation if you have the equivalence relation in the model at a pedagogical level.
But we have it. We have it. That's what I'm saying. In the argument model, we even have equivalence relation. In the argument model, equivalence relation between multiple declarative sentences is modeled by the mere fact that they're within a claim composed.
No.
Yeah,
What I'm saying is when I explain the concept of what a claim is, I'm saying a claim is an equivalence relation. And if we don't have the equivalence relation as an object, that's harder to introduce at the pedagogical level. That's all I'm saying.
But the claim, if you see the claim itself as a relation between two declarative sentences or many.
No, it's not the relation. It's the embodiment of the equivalence class.
Yes, right.
Of the equivalence relation. Don't confuse equivalence class and equivalence relation.
But you could view it as such. If you have one declarative sentence, you have this interpretation to the claim. Then you have another declarative sentence and also the interpretation to the claim. Then this whole...
I agree that you can model the symbol relations purely at the claim level. There I agree with you.
Okay.
I'm saying they're not the same thing. I'm not saying they're not homeomorphic. They are homeomorphic. But
I'm just afraid, and this is where ubiquitous language within a bound context is important. When you start mentioning homeomorphic, not the same equivalence relation, all of that language is, in my opinion, language that belongs to different bound contexts, probably more related when we start talking in detail about different curation models or sharing a curation model. And I'm all key to introduce a type of language which will be needed at that point. You need an entity equivalence relation, probably, or something along those lines. But
okay, let's make it in a separate diagram. I don't object to it existing in a separate diagram. That's fine.
That's basically what I'm suggesting.
Yeah. If that's the issue, sure, let's have it in a separate diagram.
And a matter of priorities.
What?
And a matter of priorities. That I don't think it's very fruitful to, at this point in time, start working too much on the diagram right now. I'm more with Bentley that we should start working more on adding stuff that we do already now know that we all want to model, be it negations probably, be it what is an argument in detail, what are different types of arguments. One thing that I'm very concerned with is a distinction between statement and claim. I'm personally not even convinced whether or not that distinction, as I introduce it, should be an argument model or not. The distinction is you have a statement, but somebody can claim that a statement is true. I call the latter a claim, the former.
Yeah. Okay.
Stuff like that. Do we want to model that in the argument model?
Yeah, that's perfectly, yes. We should move on to that, Isaac. Yes, absolutely. And
introducing symbol relation at this point detracts from having a focused conversation about that. That's what I'm afraid of.
Okay. The symbol relation belongs in another diagram. Fine. Cool.
But are you happy with that as well? I don't want to just talk you into it. I'm trying to...
No. I find it harder to explain that way, but it's not a big deal.
But it's because we don't speak the same language. We find it hard to understand when you do explain that way. And that's the problem. We need to find some common language.
Yeah, fair enough. No, it's and I did say I did agree that we would bound some things, and yeah, you are right that somebody may not use symbol relations to manipulate claims as a means to manipulate claims, as long as we have somewhere a diagram that explains the relation between claims and symbol relations. I think that's extremely important. Yeah. That diagram needs to exist, but it can exist separately. Cool. And I have no problem with that.
I think what I will do, because we're way over time, I will try to create an updated model that removes Socrates and all this stuff, just focus on what we are trying to share with CDL and link some of the use cases.
NSL.
Meeting in a shared document someplace.
And Society Library, please.
Yeah, I'll add Society Library as well, indeed. But I'm going to remove the individual projects. So I just added them now because to show the conflict, but let's try to keep the diagram with things that we do agree on. And then let's extend them there.
Okay.
Perfect.
Progress.
Yeah, I'm happy.
Wow, Jamie is still here.
Yeah, I'm listening in. I'm running around because I had to go, but I'm still listening.
Okay, good.
I think, it's fine by me if we wrap up. I think we achieved what we wanted to. unless there's any more questions or discussion.
No, I'm good wrapping up.
I'm good.
Okay, just to summarize, Marc-Antoine, this is nothing personal towards you. I'm not against your ideas. It's just the discussion is a necessary part of the process, right? And it sometimes can feel like you're being attacked, but I mean, in a way you are, but that's not a personal thing. It's just, that's how you create ideas collaboratively.
No, and that's why I'm still here. But it's been difficult at times, but that's for me to work on how I receive this emotionally. That's my work.
It's human to do that. It's just to emphasize we all like each other, I think, and we all, I think, overall having fun with this project. So
I'm looking forward to having more fun and being in the more let's move forward with this.
Okay. Awesome.
Excellent.
We'll get there.
We'll get there.
I'm so glad we all have the bounded context of friendship. All right. See you next time.
See you next time.
See you next time. Bye.
Bye.